A bus ticket lay on the crate, one way, to Tulsa. The kneeling man looked at it and began to tremble. "The bus leaves at 6, Callahan Reeves said so quietly that men had to lean in to hear him. "If I still see you in Chicago at 6:01, I won't offer you a ticket again." He turned to go, then paused at the doorway. "And you'll never know what I did instead. That's the worst part. All of Chicago knew this man's 3 rules. And all of Chicago knew that no one had ever broken them and lived to see the next morning." 3 nights later, on the 40th floor, snow struck the glass like fists. A crystal tray slipped from a waitress's trembling hands. Red wine bloomed across white silk. Delaney Whitaker went down onto the stone floor. Her palms flew back to catch herself, then pulled in at once, folding across her belly. The whole room saw that gesture, and understood. "Please don't send me away." Her voice broke. "Not now," Sloane Merrick smiled. Her heel ground against broken glass. She took one step forward. 200 people stopped breathing at the same moment. Someone set down a glass. Someone whispered to his wife, "We're leaving right now," because every one of them knew the second rule. No one touches a woman. No one touches a child. No one touches the old. But the man the city feared did not raise his voice. He simply walked over, took the black wool coat from his own shoulders, and laid it across the girl sitting on the floor. Then he ended his engagement, in front of 200 guests, in front of the man who was to become his father-in-law, and led her through the parting crowd, straight out into the blizzard. Not one person dared stop him. They say the boss saved a girl that night. They were wrong. Because 3 months before that night, someone had paid $40,000 to make the father of her unborn child disappear from this city. Not because of her, but because one evening, in another restaurant at table 7, she had overheard something she was never meant to hear. That man believed he had buried her in the dark of night shifts and nameless rented rooms. He never imagined she would fall straight into the house of his enemy. And now she slept beneath the roof of the one man alive who could make him pay if she ever remembered. So when the memory returns, will she stay silent to keep her life, or speak and lose the first home she has ever known? And the man who built an entire empire so that no one would ever die out in the cold, what will he do? The day he learns that the man who locked his door on his sister 15 years ago is sitting at table 3, raising a glass, smiling at him. And in the end, after all the doors that have closed in their lives, will there be one left that opens? And for whom? If this story moved you, leave a like, share it with someone on your mind, and subscribe to our channel to walk this road with us to the end. Delaney Whitaker woke because of the warmth, not because of any sound. That was the first thing that frightened her. For 15 years, she had always awakened because of something. A door slamming shut, a stranger turning over in the bed beside hers, water leaking through the pipes of boarding houses no one ever bothered to repair. But here, there was nothing at all. There was only warmth, thick and silent, settling over her like a blanket she had never asked for. She lay still for a long time, her eyes open, counting her own breaths, waiting for someone to come in and tell her to leave. No one came. Beyond the window, Chicago was white from end to end. Snow was still falling, more slowly than it had the night before, the flakes drifting sideways across the glass, as though they had the entire morning to find a place to land. From the 9th floor, she could see the streets still sleeping, a snowplow crawling along the curb, and the yellow light of a bakery that had just opened. Normally, at this hour, she would already be standing at the bus stop, both hands buried deep in the pockets of her thin coat, waiting for the first bus. Normally, at this hour, her back would already be hurting. She sat up, and the familiar wave of nausea rose inside her. She stayed still until it passed. Then she placed a hand over her stomach, very gently, the way someone might touch a door left slightly ajar. 4 months. She hadn't told anyone. She had never believed there was anyone to tell. On the chair beside the bed, her uniform was lying neatly folded, placed there by someone else. The wine stain had darkened, spreading from the front of the blouse down to the hem of the skirt, a brownish red mark that looked older than a single night. Someone had tried to wash it. She could tell from the faint scent of soap still clinging to the fabric. Someone had tried, and someone had failed, and still they had folded it carefully and left it on the chair for her. She picked up the uniform, stood before the mirror, and put it on again. The mirror in that room was so clean that she could see every tangled strand of hair at the back of her neck. She looked at the woman reflected there, 27 years old, eyes swollen, brown hair hastily tied with a stretched elastic band, wearing a waitress uniform marked by a stain that would never come out. That was her, that was everything she had, and in a room so absurdly warm. She wanted to make certain she didn't forget it. There was a knock at the door. 3 knocks, evenly spaced, without urgency. Then a rough male voice came through, the voice of a man who had smoked for 40 years and had managed to quit 10 years ago. He spoke her name, not a shortened version, but her full name, as though he were reading it from an invitation. She opened the door. The man standing there was tall and broad, with closely cropped silver hair and a white kitchen coat that had faded to the color of old ivory. He looked about 63. In his hands was a tray, and on the tray sat a steaming bowl of oatmeal, a boiled egg, a slice of buttered toast, and a cup of black tea. There were no flowers, no napkin folded into the shape of a swan. It was simply breakfast prepared by someone who understood that another person was hungry. He introduced himself as Benedict Fairlamb, but told her to call him Benny, because the other name sounded like it belonged to a bishop, and no one had ever mistaken him for one. He set the tray on the table. He didn't step any farther into the room. He stopped exactly at the threshold, lowered his hands to his sides, and waited. Lainey stood on the far side of the room without moving. She had learned that whenever someone gave you something, they asked a question immediately afterward. She waited for that question. She waited for him to ask where she had come from, how old she was, what she had done to end up on the 40th floor the night before, what she intended to do now, and who the baby's father was. She already had an answer prepared for every one of those questions, the same answers she had used for 15 years, brief, polite, and untrue. Benny didn't ask anything. He only looked at the tray, then at her, and said the oatmeal would get cold. Then he said one more thing, slowly, as though he had been considering it ever since he started up the stairs. He told her to eat, and told her that no one in that house was ever asked for their history. Lainey didn't answer, but she had noticed his hands. They rested along the edge of the tray, broad and heavy, with thick fingers and nails cut short. Across his knuckles were calluses, thick and polished, the kind no one got from chopping onions or stirring a pan. She had seen hands like those before, on men sitting in the waiting room of the assistant center. Men who filled out job applications with trembling handwriting and always arrived half an hour early, because they were terrified of being late. 8 years, maybe longer. She didn't ask, he didn't explain. He only gave her a small nod, turned away, and closed the door behind him. And in the silence he left behind, Delaney Whitaker sat down before the still warm bowl of oatmeal, lifted the spoon, and realized that this was the first breakfast of her life, for which no one expected her to pay with an answer. At midnight, she became thirsty. It was one of those things that came with pregnancy, a thirst that arrived without warning and refused to negotiate, and Lainey lay there for nearly an hour, trying to convince herself that she could endure it until morning. She could always endure things until morning. But the thirst wouldn't listen, and at last she sat up, draped her uniform over her shoulders like a robe, and opened the bedroom door. The 9th floor hallway was dark and silent. A pale yellow light spilled from wall lamps spaced 3 meters apart, enough to show her the way, but not enough to tell her where she was going. She counted the doors. She remembered Benny saying that the small kitchen was at the end of the hallway, on the right. But this house was unlike any place she had ever stayed. It had turns that seemed to exist for no reason, doors that looked exactly alike, and when she turned right, she realized she had already passed another right turn, without even knowing it. She stopped. This hallway was narrower, with dark wood floors, and at the far end, a thin line of light stretched beneath a door that had been left slightly open. There were voices inside. They weren't arguing. No one was raising his voice. Had they been, she would have turned back. It was the calmness that drew her forward, one step at a time, her bare feet moving over the cold wood, until she stood an arm's length from the door and looked through the opening. It was a kitchen. Not a small room for making tea, but a real kitchen, with a long chopping table made of thick wood, a rack of hanging cast-iron pots, and the lingering smells of onions and cold ashes. Beneath the overhead light, a man was kneeling on the tiled floor. He was around 40, wearing a shirt that had come untucked from his trousers, and he wasn't kneeling because anyone had forced him to. His hands weren't tied. There wasn't a rope anywhere in the room. No one stood behind him. The kitchen's back door stood wide open onto steps covered in snow, and no one was blocking the way. He could have risen and walked out at any moment. He didn't rise. Facing him, seated on a wooden stool, was Callahan Reeves. He wasn't wearing a jacket. He wore only a black shirt with the sleeves rolled to his elbows, and on the chopping table before him lay a steel pocket watch, its cover open, its face turned upward toward the ceiling. It was the only thing on the table. There was nothing else. Nothing in his hands. Nothing in his pockets. Only the watch, and the sound of its ticking was so clear that Lainey almost believed it was coming from inside her own chest. Callahan spoke. He spoke softly, without leaning forward, his voice even, as though he were reading from an inventory list. He said he was giving the man 10 minutes to provide a name. He said that after those 10 minutes, he wouldn't ask again. Then he sat in silence. The kneeling man began to cry. He didn't cry loudly. He cried the way grown men cry, which meant he tried not to cry at all. And because of that, his whole body began to shake. He said he had borrowed money. He said he hadn't known things would go this far. He said his wife's name twice, as though her name were a charm that might protect him. Callahan didn't answer. He didn't nod. He didn't shake his head. He gave no sign that he was listening. The hand of the watch continued to move, and Lainey understood, standing there in the dark hallway with both feet gone numb, that what made the room terrifying wasn't violence. There was no violence at all. What made it terrifying was the waiting. What made it terrifying was that a man could sit perfectly still for 10 minutes and allow time to do all the work for him. That was when she should have stepped back. She had been stepping back for 15 years. She had stepped away from rooms, conversations, and doors left slightly open, and every time she retreated, she had told herself it was wise, that this was how people survived. But something had changed since the night before, and she couldn't give it a name. Perhaps it was the hand she had placed over her stomach. Perhaps it was the breakfast that hadn't come with a question. Perhaps she was simply too tired to retreat one more time. She pushed the door open and stepped inside. Everyone in the kitchen turned to look at her. The kneeling man raised his head, his face wet, his mouth falling open. Callahan Reeves didn't move, but his eyes shifted toward her, and for the first time that night, something in his expression changed. Lainey didn't look at him. She walked directly to the other man, bent down, and spoke to him in the same voice she used with children who arrived at the shelter at 2:00 in the morning. She told him to stand up. He didn't understand. She repeated herself, more slowly. She told him the kitchen floor was cold, and that he didn't have to kneel there. The man looked at Callahan. Then he looked at her. Then he pressed his hands against the tiles and rose to his feet. The watch continued ticking on the chopping table. Lainey turned to face Callahan Reeves. She was 27 years old, less than 1.60 meters tall, wearing a uniform marked by a wine stain that wouldn't come out. And she was standing barefoot in the kitchen of the man whose name all of Chicago was afraid to speak. She said she was leaving. She said she would leave this house. Callahan opened his mouth. She didn't give him time to speak. She told him she wasn't leaving because she was afraid of him. Then she paused, and in the silence that followed, she continued more softly, almost gently, saying that she was leaving because she knew who he was about to become. No one moved. The man who had just risen stood frozen in the middle of the kitchen, afraid even to breathe. For 12 years, men had cursed Callahan Reeves, begged him for mercy, and promised to repay him with the rest of their lives. No one had ever spoken to him that way. No one had ever spoken to him as though he were a man standing at the edge of an abyss, and they could see the drop more clearly than he could. Callahan Reeves didn't answer. He reached out, closed the cover of the pocket watch, and the ticking stopped completely. She couldn't fall asleep again. She lay in the darkness of the 9th floor room, listening to the furnace breathe steadily beneath the floor, and she thought about the pocket watch being snapped shut, about that small sound, dry and final as a verdict. She didn't know what had happened in the kitchen after she turned her back and walked out. She didn't want to know. That was one of the skills she had learned before all the other children. Knowing exactly what she shouldn't ask, and knowing that once she had asked, she could never go back to being someone who didn't know. At 4:00 in the morning, she sat up. Across 7 different homes, she had learned that leaving at 4 was the kindest thing for everyone. No one had to look at anyone else. No one had to say a word. No one had to pretend to be sad. She took off the uniform and folded it. She folded it with great care, tucking both sleeves inward, smoothing the hem of the skirt with her palm, leaving the crease straight as a line of machine stitching. The wine stain remained there, dark and motionless, and she left it visible instead of hiding it inside the fold. Then she placed the uniform neatly in the center of the bed, the way someone might return a borrowed thing to the lender's table. She tore a page from her worn notebook. Sitting on the edge of the bed, she wrote in the small, even handwriting a woman named Rowan had taught her 15 years earlier, and she wrote only 2 sentences. She thanked him for the coat. Then she wrote that she wasn't good at staying. She read it once. She thought about adding something else, perhaps an apology or an explanation, but she understood that every explanation was only another way of delaying the moment when she had to walk through the door. So she folded the paper in half and placed it on top of the uniform. She put on her thin sweater, the one she had worn through 3 winters, and she left. Outside, it was 4 o'clock on a Chicago morning in the middle of December, which meant the sky was neither dark nor light, but the blue-gray color of metal that hadn't yet been fired. The snow had stopped falling, but the wind hadn't. It blew in from the lake, threading through the gaps between the streets, and instead of striking her face, it slipped beneath the fabric of her sweater, found her skin, and stayed there. She walked. The Greyhound station was 3 miles away. She knew the route because she had once slept there for 2 nights, 3 years earlier, when she was between jobs and had nowhere else to go. Her shoes were leather and had been repaired at the heels 3 times, and by the 2nd mile, snow began seeping through the patched places. She didn't stop. She counted her steps, 100, then another 100, and each time she reached 100, she lifted a hand and rested it against her stomach for a moment, not to keep it warm, but to remind herself that she still had a reason to keep moving. The bus station stayed open all night, but at that hour it was nearly empty. Harsh white fluorescent lights glared overhead. The floor was stained with slushy mud, and on the row of orange plastic seats, there was only an old man asleep with his hat pulled over his face. Lainey went to the ticket counter. She placed her wallet on the glass, opened it, and counted. She counted twice, slowly, as though the 2nd time might somehow produce a different number. $23. The ticket clerk looked at her through the glass, a woman around 50 with the eyes of someone who had seen this same thing 1,000 times, and said the cheapest ticket was $40. There wasn't another bus. There wasn't a discount. The woman didn't sound cruel. She simply stated the amount. Lainey nodded, said thank you, closed her wallet, and went to sit on the row of seats. She sat with her back straight and her hands folded in her lap, and she didn't cry because she had learned something a long time ago. That crying was what people did when they believed someone might hear them. She sat that way for 40 minutes. Her hands changed from red to white, then grew stiff, and she could no longer feel the tips of her fingers. She thought about going back. The thought came, and she pushed it away, and it returned, and she pushed it away again. Then the station door opened, and a rush of cold air entered with a man. She recognized the sound of his footsteps before she recognized him. They were the steps of someone who never hurried, not because nothing was urgent, but because he had never needed to prove to anyone that he was in a hurry. Callahan Reeves passed the sleeping old man without waking him. He didn't look around for her. He knew where she was. He walked to the row of seats and sat down exactly 1 empty chair away from her. No closer. He didn't take off his coat. He didn't place anything over her shoulders. He didn't hand her a piece of paper, reach for his wallet, or make her any promises. He simply sat there, both hands resting on his knees, looking straight ahead at the flickering departure board. He remained silent for about half a minute, long enough for Lainey to understand that he wasn't going to explain why he was there, and long enough for her to understand that he wasn't going to ask why she was there. Then he spoke softly without turning his head. He said she owed him a coat. 3 days later, Benny took her downstairs to the kitchen. Not the small kitchen on the 9th floor, but the great restaurant kitchen on the 40th, where 12 people worked from 6 o'clock in the morning until midnight, and steam rose from stock pots that stood as high as a person's chest. He didn't lead her into the dining room. He didn't ask whether she wanted to work in the dining room. He simply handed her a white apron, pointed toward the sink in the farthest corner, and told her that spot was hers. Lainey understood immediately. The dining room was where people could see her. The kitchen was where they couldn't, and she understood that this 63-year-old man had just done something kind that he would never admit to doing. She worked through the entire morning without anyone asking her a single question. Around noon, Benny called her over to the chopping table and placed a basket of onions in front of her. He stood beside her, took up a knife, and began to slice. He cut quickly and evenly without looking down. He told her to watch the way he curled his fingers inward. Then, between two strokes of the blade, he said there were 3 rules in this house, and that anyone new should learn them before learning anything else. The first rule, he said, was that no one was ever left outside in the cold. Anyone who knocked on the back door after midnight was given food. No one asked for a name. No one asked for a reason. The second rule was that no one laid a hand on women, no one laid a hand on children, and no one laid a hand on the elderly. He paused there for the briefest moment, then continued slicing. And the third rule, he said, was that anyone who broke the first 2 rules had no third rule meant for them. Lainey stood there with onion water stinging both hands, and she asked him. She asked why everyone obeyed. It wasn't the police, it wasn't the courts, it was only 3 sentences spoken by one man. So why did the entire city obey them? Benny stopped cutting. He didn't stop abruptly. He lowered the blade onto the chopping board very gently, then looked into the basket of onions as though there were something inside that needed to be counted. He remained still for so long that the noise of the kitchen seemed to recede, the boiling water, the clatter of pans, someone calling out an order from the other end of the room. Then he said, his voice rougher than usual, that they weren't the rules of a crime boss. He said they were the gravestone of a girl. He said nothing more. He picked up the knife and finished slicing the remaining onions, and Lainey didn't ask again, because she recognized the sound of a sentence that had no next part. That afternoon, the kitchen door flew open, and a little boy came running in. He was about 6 years old, with straw blonde hair sticking straight up, wearing a red sweater whose sleeves hung past his hands, and clutching a tin box of crayons against his chest, one corner of it dented inward. He ran directly through the middle of the kitchen, ducked beneath a tray carried by one of the kitchen assistants, and no one shouted at him. No one told him to leave. The woman washing dishes at the sink beside Lainey looked up and smiled, and Lainey understood that she was his mother. Benny set down his knife. He reached up to a shelf, took down a small cake that was still warm, broke it in half, and handed one piece to the boy. The boy accepted it with both hands. He ate, and as he ate, his eyes drifted closed, and Benny stood watching him with an expression Lainey had never seen on the face of a man who had once carried calluses like those across his knuckles. Then the boy noticed Lainey. He stopped, looked up at her, and asked who she was. She told him her name. He said his name was Noah. Then he sat down flat on the tiled floor, opened his box of crayons, chose a yellow one, and began drawing on the back of an old menu. He drew for about 10 minutes, occasionally sticking his tongue out at the corner of his mouth as he concentrated. Then he stood, ran over to Lainey, and held up the paper. It was a house drawn the way children always drew houses, with a triangular roof, 2 square windows, and a chimney sending out 3 round rings of smoke. But the door wasn't closed. The boy had drawn it open toward the outside, a slanted rectangle, and inside the doorway he had filled everything with yellow, the yellow of lamplight, pressed so heavily onto the page that the wax left a glossy layer across the paper. Lainey took the drawing. She asked why the door was open. Noah shrugged and said it was so people could come inside. Then he ran away because his mother had called him. Lainey stood there for a long time, holding the old menu in her hand. Then she folded it into quarters and slipped it into the pocket of her apron. She would keep it there. That evening, as her shift was nearly ending, she stood washing the final stack of pots and realized that her back was hurting in a new way, the pain rising from her lower spine into both shoulder blades, forcing her to stop every few minutes and brace one wet hand against the edge of the sink. She tried not to let anyone notice. She lowered her head, worked faster, and said nothing. Benny passed behind her carrying a tray of freshly sharpened knives in both hands. He didn't stop. He didn't look at her. But when she lifted her head after finishing the next batch of pots, she saw that a wooden stool had appeared beside the sink, placed close enough for her to sit while still reaching the faucet. She looked around the kitchen. No one was watching her. Benny stood at the other end of the room with his back turned, placing knives into a drawer and calling out to one of the kitchen assistants in the same irritable voice he used with everyone. He said nothing. He would never say anything. And Lainey Whitaker, 27 years old, a woman who had never once sat down while working, lowered herself onto that stool. 3 weeks passed the way time always passes inside a kitchen, which meant no one noticed it passing at all. Lainey arrived at 6 o'clock, sat on the wooden stool, washed, wiped, chopped, and returned to her room close to midnight. She didn't say much, but people began calling her by name, and once, one of the kitchen assistants saved the last piece of bread for her, and she stood looking at it for a long time before taking it. On the 23rd night, Benny came down to the kitchen at 1 o'clock in the morning to turn off the ovens, and he found her asleep. She was sitting on the stool with her back against the sink, her head tilted to one side, her apron still tied around her waist. Cradled tightly in her lap, both arms wrapped around it, was a tin box. It was the kind of cookie tin people gave one another during the holidays, with a picture of a deer on the lid, though the paint had worn away so badly that all that remained of the animal were its 2 antlers and a patch of its back. All 4 corners of the box were dented. The lid no longer closed properly, and someone had secured it with a rubber band. Benny stood there for quite a while. He had lived for 63 years, and 8 of those years had been spent in a place where every man held something against his chest while he slept, and he knew that people only clung that tightly to things that had no value to anyone else. He didn't wake her. He went to boil water. The sound of the kettle roused her. She jerked upright, both hands tightening around the box, her eyes not yet fully focused, and the first thing she said was an apology. Benny told her to stay where she was. He placed 2 cups on the chopping table, poured the tea, and sat across from her. He didn't look at the box. It was because he didn't look that Lainey opened it. She did it slowly, removing the rubber band, prying up the lid with her thumb, and inside there were no cookies. There was paper. 7 sheets stacked one on top of another, their edges softened by the touch of human hands over too many years. They were pre-printed forms with boxes to check, ruled lines to fill in, and spaces for signatures and official stamps. At the top of each page was the name of an agency, and beneath it was her own name, Delaney Whitaker, written in 7 different hands by 7 different social workers. She laid the pages on the wooden table beside one another, the way someone might spread out a deck of cards. On the first page, she was 6 years old. In the box marked Reason, there was a single typed sentence, brief and without feeling, stating that the child had been transferred to another family. On the 3rd page, she was 9, and the sentence said the child had been unable to adjust to her current environment. On the 5th, she was 11, and someone had written by hand in the empty space that the family had just welcomed a biological child. Lainey didn't read any of it aloud. She simply placed 1 finger on each page, one at a time, as though taking attendance. Benny didn't ask anything. He lifted his tea, took a sip, and looked toward the window where snow was gathering along the frame. Then Lainey spoke. She said people had always told her she should throw them away. At the shelter, a counselor had once told her that keeping them would only prevent the wound from healing. She said the woman was probably right. Then she rested her hand on the tin and said very softly, almost to herself, that if she threw them away, there would be nothing left to prove she had ever lived in anyone's home. Benny set down his cup. He didn't speak. He was a man who had learned long ago that some statements didn't require an answer, and that answering them would be an insult. Lainey picked up the final sheet. It was the newest of the 7, and also the most worn, because it lay on top and she had held it more often than the others. She had been 12 years old. In the box marked foster family were 2 words written in blue ink, in a graceful slanting hand. Rowan Kessler. Beneath it was an address in Michigan. In the box marked length of stay was a number, and that number was 11 months, not a year. 11 months. She had counted every day of the 12th month, and she had never reached the end of it. In the box marked reason for termination were only 4 typed words. The ink faded to gray. Family moved out of state. Lainey stared at those words. She had looked at them more often than she had ever looked at anyone's face. And she said nothing else, because there was nothing to say, because inside those words there was no one she was allowed to hate, no one who had done anything wrong, no one who had treated her cruelly. A family moved out of state. That was what had happened. That was something people were allowed to do. And a 12-year-old child was transferred into another file, like a sheet of paper moved from one drawer to another. She stacked the 7 pages in their proper order, placed them back inside the tin, closed the lid, and wrapped the rubber band around it again. Benny reached for the teapot. He didn't say a single word. He only refilled her cup and slid it across the wooden table toward her, and in that vast, empty kitchen, at 1 o'clock on a winter morning in Chicago, steam rose from the tea between them like something that had finally been given permission to stay. The woman who usually cleaned the 9th floor came down with the flu, and on a Tuesday morning, Benny told Lainey to go up and take her place for 2 hours. He said it as though he were asking her to carry a basket of potatoes. But when she reached the floor and stood before that hallway of dark wood, she realized it was the same corridor she had wandered into nearly a month earlier, and she realized that Benny knew it, and that he had done this deliberately. She didn't understand why. She only knew that the man never did anything without a reason, and that he would never tell her what that reason was. The study was at the end of the hallway, its door left slightly open. Inside, there was nothing resembling what she had imagined the workplace of a man like Callahan Reeves would look like. There was no liquor cabinet, no paintings, no awards, no photographs with famous people, nothing that told a visitor who the owner of the room was. There was only a wooden desk, 2 chairs, a brass desk lamp, a bookcase filled with old law books, and a window overlooking Lake Michigan, gray as a sheet of lead. Lainey began dusting. She worked her way out from the bookcase, careful not to move anything from its place. And when she reached the desk, she saw the ledger. It lay open in the middle of the desk. Beneath the circle of light from the lamp someone had forgotten to turn off. Its cover was brown leather, worn at all 4 corners, the spine cracked and repaired with thick thread. It had no lock, it hadn't been hidden. It lay there open, like a menu on a restaurant table. Lainey knew she should turn away. She had survived 27 years by turning away from things that didn't belong to her. But her eyes had already fallen to the page, and on that page there were only names. No numbers, no dates, no notes. Only names, handwritten one to a line, in black ink that faded more with every page, in the cramped, slanting script of a man who wrote quickly and never wrote anything twice. She turned one page, then another. She didn't know what she was looking for. Perhaps she was looking for her own name, and she was afraid of finding it, and more afraid of not finding it. The names went on and on. On the 4th page, she recognized one she had once read in the newspaper, the name of a federal judge. On the 9th, the name of a county sheriff. On the 13th, a name known to anyone who had ever turned on a television in the state of Illinois. A congressman, and 2 lines below it was another congressman. And on the 17th page, there was a third. She turned to the last page that contained writing. The final name had been numbered, 214. Lainey stood there with the dust cloth in her hand, and she felt a chill that didn't come from the window. She had expected to see numbers. She had expected this to be what people in films called a black book, proof of envelopes, wire transfers, and money washed through 3 different accounts. That, she would have understood. Money was something she understood. Money was what had bought away the man who once said he loved her. But there was no money here. There were only names. And it was that emptiness that frightened her, more than anything she had seen in the kitchen that night. She heard the footsteps before she had time to close the ledger. Callahan Reeves stood in the doorway, holding a cup, the top button of his shirt undone. He looked at the ledger. Then he looked at her. And she had already prepared everything she always prepared. The apology, the explanation, the act of setting down the cloth and walking out of someone else's house within 10 minutes. But he wasn't angry. Nothing in his face changed. He stepped inside, placed the cup on the edge of the desk, and he didn't close the ledger. He stood there looking down at the page beside her, as though the 2 of them were studying an old photograph together. Then he spoke. He said he didn't take money from anyone. He said it in the steady voice of a man explaining how to operate a machine. He said that when someone on that list came to see him, the person usually brought a briefcase, and he always returned it at the door, unopened. Then he said that what he took was one nod, only once. One yes, for a favor that hadn't yet been named. He picked up a pen and pointed to a name near the bottom of the page. He said that this man had owed him for 3 years. For 3 years, every morning when that man woke, the first thing he thought about wasn't his wife, and it wasn't his work, but whether that would be the day the telephone rang. Callahan set down the pen. He looked toward the window, where Lake Michigan lay flat and gray beneath the December sky, and he spoke the final sentence so quietly that Lainey had to lean closer to hear it. He said that he never told them in advance when he would ask. Otis Merrick arrived on a Thursday evening without an appointment at 7:15. The doorman called the kitchen before he called the dining room, and Benny answered the telephone, and Lainey was standing 3 steps away from him, so she saw what happened to his face. He lowered the receiver very slowly. Then he turned toward the kitchen and told all 12 people working there that no one was to enter the dining room that night unless called by name. No one asked why. The man who entered the Meridian room that evening was 66 years old. He wore a gray suit, tailored so perfectly that it seemed to disappear against his body, and he didn't allow anyone to take his coat. He hung it up himself. His hair was silver and combed straight back, and his hands trembled. It was the trembling of age, a faint shaking at the fingertips, the kind a person couldn't hide while holding a newspaper. But his eyes didn't tremble. They swept once across the empty dining room, counting the tables, counting the doors, then stopped at the corner table where Callahan Reeves sat alone. Table number 3. Callahan didn't stand. He didn't offer an invitation. Otis Merrick pulled out the chair and sat across from him, and he began speaking immediately, without a greeting, as though they were continuing a conversation that had been interrupted the week before. He said his daughter had been crying for 4 weeks. He said he wasn't a man who held grudges, that men sometimes lost their tempers, and that something that happened at a party should be buried at that same party. He said the agreement between the two families had been signed 18 months earlier, and the ink on it had barely had time to dry. Then he placed both trembling hands on the table and said what he had come there to say. He told Callahan that he should marry Sloane after all. He told him that if he didn't, the Port Council would meet on Monday, and the docking rights at South Dock would be reconsidered. He used that exact word, reconsidered, and he smiled as he said it. The smile of a man who had delivered the sentence to 40 different people over 40 years, and had never seen anyone fail to turn pale. Callahan Reeves didn't turn pale. He reached for the bottle of wine standing in the center of the table. He picked up Otis's glass, turned it gently in his hand, and examined it beneath the light as though checking it for flaws. Then he poured slowly, more slowly than anyone had ever poured wine for a guest. The red wine ran down the side of the glass in a thin, even, unbroken stream, and in that empty dining room, the only sound was the wine touching the bottom of the glass. Otis waited. He began to grow restless, and he hated himself for growing restless. Callahan filled the glass to exactly 1/3, not a drop more, then set the bottle down and pushed the glass with 2 fingers. Then he spoke. He asked Otis Merrick whether he knew why Callahan never sat with his back to a door. Otis looked at him. Then he laughed, and there was relief in that laugh, because at last the conversation had returned to a language he understood, the language of men measuring one another. He said it was because Callahan was afraid. He addressed him as boy rather than as sir, and he let that word fall onto the table between them. Callahan didn't react. He looked down at his own wineglass, still unfilled, still empty. Then he raised his eyes, and he said that one night, 15 years earlier, he had turned his back. He said it in the same voice a man might use to recite his home address. There was nothing in it. No tears, no strain, no pause to draw breath. Then he continued, and the second sentence was as calm as the first. He said that when he turned back, his sister was no longer there. Silence settled over table number 3. It wasn't the silence of 2 men who had run out of things to say. It was the kind of silence anyone who had ever stood at the edge of a frozen lake would recognize. The silence of something very thick and very deep lying directly beneath their feet. In the kitchen, 2 doors away, Benny stood motionless with a knife in his hand, and he stopped cutting. Otis Merrick didn't understand. He sat there, 66 years old, the owner of an investment bank, a man who had sat in conference rooms, where the fate of 10,000 people was decided in 40 minutes, and he believed the man across from him had just revealed a wound. He believed it was a weakness. He had spent his entire life searching for weakness, and whenever he found it, his instinct was to smile. He said everyone had suffered losses. He said that was why people needed family. Then Otis Merrick raised his glass, tapped it lightly against Callahan Reeves's empty one with a small chime, and drank. He finished that 1/3 glass of wine in 2 swallows. He set it down, said the council would meet on Monday, and that he hoped there would be good news, then stood, took his coat, and walked out. Callahan Reeves remained alone at table number 3, seated before a glass with nothing in it. He didn't move for a very long time. Beyond the windows of the 40th floor, snow began to fall again. Callahan Reeves knew what Otis Merrick had said to the Port Council before the Port Council ever met. He knew because he always knew. But, this time, there was something else he knew. Only 7 people in the world had access to the schedules of his shipments, and by lunchtime, He had already cleared 6 of them. The 7th was named Wendell Pike. Wendell Pike was 51 years old. He had walked beside Callahan Reeves for 12 years. One evening at the docks in the spring of 2014, a man had aimed a weapon at Callahan, and Pike had stepped in front of him, and the bullet had entered Pike's shoulder instead of Callahan's chest, and from that day forward, Pike had never been able to raise his left arm higher than his ear. He had never mentioned that night again. Not once. That evening, Pike came to the Meridian kitchen alone, without being summoned. He stood in the doorway and looked inside, and Benny, who was standing beside the stove with a pan of onions, glanced up only once before lowering his eyes again. He didn't turn off the flame. He didn't stop working. He tossed the onions, added a pinch of salt, lowered the heat, and the oil continued to hiss through the kitchen as though this were an ordinary evening. Lainey stood in the far corner beside the sink, her hands still wet. She was about to leave. Benny didn't look at her, but he lowered 2 fingers to the chopping table and tapped once, lightly, and she understood that leaving now would draw more attention than remaining still. So she remained still. Callahan Reeves entered through the side door. He had brought no one with him. He pulled out the wooden stool, the same stool Lainey always used, placed it in the middle of the tiled floor, and sat down. He didn't say a word, and Wendell Pike, the man who couldn't raise his left arm above his ear, walked into the center of the kitchen on his own and lowered himself to his knees. No one told him to kneel. No one stood behind him. The back door of the kitchen remained slightly open onto the snow-covered steps. He knelt because he knew the rules, and he knew the rules because he had been there when they were written. He spoke first. He said he had a son. He said it quickly, urgently, the way a person throws something in front of himself to stop whatever is rushing toward him. Callahan Reeves nodded. He said he knew. Then, in the same voice he used when reading an inventory list, he said that he had paid the entire hospital bill that morning. He stated the amount, $300,000. He said the surgery had been scheduled, the doctor had been chosen, and the boy would recover. He spoke those final 3 words clearly, separately, and looked directly into Pike's eyes as he said them. Wendell Pike lifted his head. He didn't understand. That was what Lainey saw most clearly from the corner of the kitchen. Not fear, but incomprehension. The expression of a man who had just heard a sentence spoken in his native language, and still couldn't assemble its meaning. His mouth opened, then closed again. Then he began to tremble, and he pressed one hand against the tiled floor to keep himself from collapsing. Callahan Reeves remained still on the stool. He didn't lean forward. He didn't raise his voice. He said that Pike only had to ask him. Then he paused, and in that pause the oil continued hissing on the stove, and Callahan spoke the final words. 12 years. Nothing came after that. The silence lasted so long that it stopped being silence and became something with weight, pressing down against the tiles, pressing down upon the shoulders of the kneeling man. Benny turned the onions in the pan. He didn't look up. Then Callahan said the rest. He said Pike's son would live. He said Pike would leave Chicago that night, and he said Pike would never see the boy again. Wendell Pike collapsed onto both hands. He begged. He called Callahan by his first name, not his surname, but by the shortened form that only 3 people in the world were permitted to use, and he said Callahan could take anything. He said to take everything he owned, his house, his money, these 2 hands, anything at all, except he couldn't finish the final word. Callahan Reeves didn't wait for him to finish. He said only 2 words, Rule 3. Then he spoke the man's name, Wendell, and delivered the final sentence. Pike himself had written it with him, and Wendell Pike stopped begging. Because it was true. Because 12 years earlier in another room, he had sat beside this man and read every word aloud, while Callahan wrote them down, and Pike himself had said that without the 3rd rule, the first 2 were nothing but empty words. He had believed it then. He still believed it now. That was why he didn't rise and run through the door that remained open. He stayed on his knees, 51 years old, and cried the way a man cries when he has run out of every argument. Callahan Reeves stood. He returned the stool to its place beside the sink, carefully, using both hands, as though leaving a chair in the wrong place were the only thing in that room that could still be corrected. Then he walked toward the kitchen door. At the threshold he stopped, for only 1 second. No longer. He didn't turn around. He didn't say anything else, and to anyone else in that kitchen, it would have looked like nothing more than a man pausing because he had remembered something, then deciding it didn't matter. But Lainey Whitaker stood in the corner, less than 4 steps from him, and she saw his right hand hanging beside his hip. She saw his fingers tremble. Not much. It wasn't the trembling of old age, like the hands of Otis Merrick. It was the small, rapid trembling of a cord pulled too tight that hadn't yet snapped. It lasted for about 3 breaths. Then he closed his hand into a fist, stepped into the hallway, and the door shut behind him. At the stove, Benny Fairlamb turned off the flame. The onions had been scorched for a long time, and no one in the room had noticed. Wendell Pike got to his feet. It took him quite a while, one hand braced against the tiled floor, then against his knee, before he finally stood upright with the left shoulder he could no longer raise. He wiped his face with his sleeve. Then he walked toward the kitchen door, slowly, like a man crossing his own room for the last time before moving away. Callahan Reeves was already in the hallway, but he hadn't gone far. He stood about 5 steps from the door with his back turned, one hand resting against the wall. He heard the kitchen door open. He didn't turn around, and Wendell Pike, standing at the threshold, spoke the first sentence of the rest of his life. He said that before he left, there was something he had owed Callahan for 15 years. Callahan Reeves turned. In the kitchen, Benny Fairlamb stood motionless beside the stove, its flame already extinguished. In the far corner, Lainey Whitaker stopped breathing. Pike began to tell the story, and he told it in the flat, steady voice of a man who had rehearsed it in his mind every night for 15 years and knew exactly how long it would take. He said the night had been February 14th. He said he had been 36 years old then, working for another man, someone whose name no one remembered anymore, and that his only job that night had been to sit in a car parked across the street from the building at 1140 Halsted Street and write down who entered and who left. He said the temperature was 20 degrees below zero. Then he said he had seen the girl. He didn't say her name. He only said the girl, and Callahan Reeves didn't move at all. Pike said she had arrived shortly before 1 o'clock in the morning. She was very young. She was pregnant, and her coat wasn't thick enough, and she knocked on the door. He said she knocked 3 times, each knock about a minute apart, and between them she pressed her forehead against the door. The lights in the lobby were still on. The doorman was sitting just inside. He saw her. He stood, walked toward the door, and Pike had thought that was the end of it, that she would be allowed inside. But the telephone on the doorman's desk rang. Pike said he watched the man turn back to answer it. He said the call lasted less than 20 seconds. The doorman replaced the receiver, returned to the door, and didn't open it. He only stood behind the glass, looking out at her, and shook his head once. Then he dimmed the lobby lights and went back to his desk. The call had come from an extension inside the building itself, from one of the upper floors. Pike said he had remained in the car for another 40 minutes, and he had watched the girl sit down on the steps, and he had thought about opening the car door. He said that, then stopped for a very long time. Then he said he hadn't opened the door. He said that 3 days later someone came to see him, not to threaten him, only to hand him an envelope and explain that the building at 1140 Halsted Street belonged to a company headed by a man named Otis Merrick, and that it would be better for everyone if no one remembered that a car had been parked across the street that night. Pike said he had accepted the envelope. He named the amount inside it, and the number was so small that when they heard it, no one in the kitchen could breathe, because it was small, because it was cheap, because a human life could turn out to be worth so little. Callahan Reeves stood in the hallway and didn't say a word. Pike continued. Then he said that 3 years later, he went looking for Callahan Reeves, who had been sitting in taverns on the south side of the city, with nothing in his hands but rage. He said he had asked for work, and he said that for the next 12 years, everyone, including Callahan, believed Wendell Pike had come because he believed in those 3 rules. Then Wendell Pike raised his head and looked directly into the face of the man for whom he had taken a bullet. He said he hadn't come to work for Callahan because he admired him. He said he had come because he knew that one day Callahan would discover the truth, and he wanted to stay close enough to know when that day arrived. 12 years. 12 years sitting at Callahan Reeves's right hand during meetings. 12 years guarding the door while he slept. 12 years taking him home on the nights of February 14th, when Callahan drank and spoke to no one, and Pike was the only person permitted to remain in the room. 12 years listening to him speak about his sister and saying nothing. a bullet in the left shoulder, not out of loyalty, but because one man was watching a fire and wanted to remain close enough to see which way it would spread. Wendell Pike didn't apologize. He didn't say he was sorry, perhaps because he knew that any word added now would be an insult. He only stood there for one more moment, then turned, crossed the kitchen, opened the back door, and stepped onto the snow-covered stairs. The door closed behind him. No one stopped him. No one followed him. In the hallway, Callahan Reeves remained exactly where he was. Then he took 2 steps into the kitchen. Then he stopped. Then he sat down. Not on a chair. He lowered himself onto the tiled floor, his back against a cabinet, his legs stretched out before him, both hands resting open on his thighs. He sat like a man who had just set down something he had carried for 15 years, and had only now discovered it had never belonged to him. Benny Fairlamb turned away. He picked up the pan of burned onions, emptied it into the trash, and began washing it, and the running water was the only sound in the kitchen. In the corner, behind a stack of pots as high as her shoulders, Delaney Whitaker stood motionless. She had heard everything, every word, and in that moment, she understood that she had just entered a room she would never be able to leave again. She remained in the corner of the kitchen for nearly another hour. Not because she wanted to stand there, because she couldn't walk out. If she did, she would have to pass the man sitting on the floor, with both hands open on his thighs, and she knew there were moments when seeing another person was an act one had no right to commit. So she stayed still behind the stack of pots, listening to the water running where Benny washed the pan, listening to the sound of her own breathing. Close to 3 o'clock in the morning, Callahan Reeves stood up. He didn't brush off his trousers. He left the kitchen through the hallway door, and his footsteps were as steady as they had always been, and that was what made Lainey shiver. She returned to her room. She didn't turn on the light. She sat on the edge of the bed in the darkness and remained there for a very long time. She tried to think about practical things, about her shift the next morning, about the first week's wages Benny had given her in a brown paper envelope that she hadn't touched. But her mind wouldn't work. It kept hearing the same sentence again and again, and it wasn't the sentence about the building at 1140 Halsted Street, and it wasn't the name Otis Merrick. It was 12 years. 12 years of one man sitting at another man's right hand, taking a bullet for him, driving him home on nights when he wouldn't speak to anyone, and through all those 12 years, waiting, not waiting to save him, waiting to see which way the fire would spread. And Delaney Whitaker, sitting in the darkness, understood something she had never allowed herself to consider. She understood that if Wendell Pike could remain that close for so many years without anyone seeing him, then she was close too. She too was standing in the corner of the kitchen. She too was hearing things she shouldn't hear. And she didn't have 12 years. She had 4 weeks. She thought about his hand, trembling beside his hip, for 3 breaths before closing into a fist. She thought about the pocket watch snapping shut. She thought about the way he had returned the stool to its proper place beside the sink with both hands, carefully, immediately after taking away everything another man had. And she realized she wasn't afraid of what he might do to her. She was afraid of the opposite. She was afraid he wouldn't do anything at all, that he would continue treating her kindly, that she would stay another month, then 3 months, until she became someone who knew too much and could no longer leave. 7 times, she had been transferred into another file. Not once had anyone asked what she wanted. This time they had. This time she still had a choice. At 4 o'clock in the morning she stood up. She didn't turn on the light. She put on her thin sweater, slipped into the shoes whose heels had been repaired 3 times, and stood before the door with one hand resting on the knob. Then she turned and looked back at the room. Her notebook lay on the table. Inside it were blank pages and a pencil. She stared at it for about 30 seconds, and she didn't go back to take it. The last time, she had written 2 sentences. She had thanked him for the coat, and she had said she wasn't good at staying. The last time, she had still been able to write, because the last time she had been leaving a stranger's house. Now she couldn't write anything, because any words she left behind would be proof that she had been there that night, that she had stood behind the stack of pots, that she had heard. She was so afraid that she didn't dare leave even a single line. She opened the door and stepped into the hallway, and she took the stairs instead of the elevator, all 9 floors, and she went out through the back door and walked into the darkness of the city. At 7 o'clock in the morning, Benny Fairlamb went up to the 9th floor. He knocked twice. Then he pushed the door open. The bed had been made smooth. The clean uniform hung from a hook. The notebook lay neatly on the table, every page still there. There was no note. There were no words. Benny stood in the middle of the room and looked around once, and then he saw it. The tin box was still lying on the pillow. He stood looking at it for a very long time. Then he went downstairs, walked along the hallway of dark wood, and knocked on the study door, and he said exactly one sentence to Callahan Reeves. No more and no less, that the box was still on the pillow. Callahan Reeves was standing beside the window. He didn't turn around immediately. He remained there, looking out at Lake Michigan. Gray as a sheet of lead beneath the January sky, and Benny saw his shoulders lower slightly, almost imperceptibly, the way a person's shoulders fall when he has just understood the thing he was afraid of. Because some people leave and take everything with them, and some people leave behind the only thing they own. Only one kind of person does the second, and they do it because they have calculated that they won't live long enough to come back for it. He searched for her for 4 days. He didn't mobilize anyone. He didn't call a single name from the brown leather ledger. He went himself, every evening from 7 o'clock until the doors closed, through every place a 27-year-old woman with $23 in her wallet might go. He didn't search the hotels. He didn't search the bus station, because he knew she couldn't afford a ticket, and he knew she wouldn't ask anyone for help. On the 4th day, a woman working the night shift at an assistance center on the south side told him that a new girl had arrived, without identification, asking for no bed, only for work. The shelter occupied the basement of an old church that hadn't held a service in 10 years. The ceiling was low. The lights were fluorescent. The air smelled of soup, damp clothing, and 100 human beings breathing together in a space too small to hold them. Callahan Reeves stepped down from the last stair and stopped. He had imagined this scene for 4 days. He had imagined her curled on a bunk in the corner, her face turned toward the wall. She wasn't lying on a bed. She was standing behind the kitchen counter, an apron tied across her chest, a large ladle in one hand, spooning soup into plastic bowls and pushing them across the counter. A long line of people stood before her, 30 people, perhaps more. An old man wearing 2 hats, one on top of the other. A young man whose hands shook from the cold. A woman clutching a plastic bag that contained everything she owned. Lainey served the soup and spoke their names. She knew their names. After 4 days, she already knew their names. Callahan Reeves didn't approach her. He walked to the long table at the far end of the room, where the light was dimmest, and sat down. He removed his coat, folded it, and laid it across his lap. No one noticed him. In that basement, a man in a black shirt sitting silently wasn't something worth noticing. He sat there for 2 hours. He watched her work, and during those 2 hours he saw what he hadn't seen throughout the month she had lived in his house. He watched her bend to lift the soup pot, and he saw her pause for half a beat before raising it. He saw her reach one hand behind her, press it against her lower back, and remain still for 3 seconds before lowering her hand and continuing to serve. She made that movement 8 times in 2 hours. He counted. She didn't know she was doing it. The last person finished eating close to 11 o'clock. She wiped the counter, she stacked the bowls, she switched off one of the lights. Then she turned and she saw him. She didn't startle. She stood there with the cloth still in her hand and looked at him, and there was no fear in her face and no surprise. There was only a deep exhaustion, the exhaustion of someone who had always known this day would come and had spent all 4 days preparing for it, only to discover she still wasn't ready. She walked to the table. She sat across from him. She placed both hands on its surface and waited for him to say she had to return. Callahan Reeves didn't say that. He remained silent for another moment, and then he told her he had read her file. She didn't ask where he had gotten it. He said there had been 7 homes. He said none of them had kept her longer than 11 months. He spoke the number aloud, 11, and left it lying between them on the plastic table in the basement of a church. Lainey looked down at her hands. She said nothing, because, in 27 years, no one had ever spoken that number to her. People said she had endured a great deal of instability. People said her childhood hadn't been easy. They used soft, rounded words, words that could roll off a table without breaking anything. No one had ever set the number down. Then Callahan reached into his coat pocket. He took something out, placed it on the table between them, and pushed it toward her with 2 fingers. exactly the way he had pushed the wineglass toward Otis Merrick. It was a key, only one key, made of brass, with no chain, no ring, nothing attached to it. It lay beneath the fluorescent light, small and ordinary. He said she could throw it into the gutter. He said he wouldn't come looking for her a second time, that if she stood up and walked through that door, he would remain there until someone made him leave, and afterward he wouldn't return. Then he spoke the final words. He said that all 7 times, someone had handed her a bag. They had folded her clothes, packed them into it, placed the bag in her hands, and put her into a car. 7 times she had held a bag someone else had given her. He said this was the first time in her life she had been given a key, her own key, and Delaney Whitaker cried. She made no sound. She sat with her back straight, both hands still resting on the table, and the tears continued to fall, and she didn't lift a hand to wipe them away. Perhaps because she didn't realize she was crying. She hadn't cried on the 40th floor, when 200 people watched her fall onto the stone floor. She hadn't cried at the bus station when she counted $23 on the glass. She hadn't cried in that basement through 4 nights. She cried now, before a brass key worth less than $1, because she was 27 years old, and no one had ever given her the right to unlock a door from the inside. Callahan Reeves didn't reach for her. He said nothing more. He sat there in silence and let her cry until there were no tears left, the way someone sits beside the shore and waits for the water to recede. Then she reached out, picked up the key, and closed her hand around it so tightly that when she opened her palm 30 minutes later, its shape was still pressed into her skin. 3 weeks later, on a Saturday morning, Callahan Reeves stood in the doorway of the Meridian kitchen and told Laney that he needed to go to Michigan. He said he would leave and return the same day. Then he said she should come with him. He didn't explain. She had lived beside this man long enough to know that when he offered no explanation, it was because the explanation would make her refuse to go. So she went. The road north followed the lakeshore, and the snow along both sides had turned gray from the salt spread across the pavement. He drove. He didn't turn on the radio. Near noon, when they left the highway and turned onto a narrow 2-lane road lined with bare maple trees, Laney saw a sign bearing the name of the county, and she recognized it. She had read that name thousands of times, written in blue ink in a graceful, slanting hand on the most worn of the 7 pages. She turned toward him. She asked where he was taking her. Callahan Reeves kept his eyes on the road and said that he had found her. The car stopped in front of a 1-story wooden house painted blue, with a porch and a large maple tree in the yard. Smoke rose from the chimney. Laney sat motionless in the car for 2 minutes. Then she opened the door, climbed the steps, and stood there, and she remembered that she had stood in this exact place before. She remembered being 12 years old, holding a cloth bag. The woman had folded her clothes with great care, 1 piece at a time, and placed them inside. There had been a tin of warm cookies in the bag. That was what she remembered most clearly, not the journey, the cookies. She knocked. The door opened, and a woman stood there. She was 60 years old. Her hair was pure white and cut short. She was very thin in the way that clothing no longer seemed to touch the body beneath it, and she held on to the doorframe for support. She looked at Laney for about 2 seconds. Then she said her name. Not Laney. She said Delaney, the whole name, the name 7 social workers had written in 7 different hands, the name no one had ever spoken in that voice. Rowan Kessler invited them into the living room. She made tea with trembling hands, and Callahan Reeves rose to lift the kettle for her without saying anything, and she allowed him to do it. Then she sat down and looked at Laney for a long time, her gaze settling where the sweater curved over Laney's stomach, and she didn't ask. She only said that she hadn't moved out of state. Laney didn't understand. Rowan said that in April of that year, she had gone to the doctor because of a cough that wouldn't go away, and 3 weeks later she received the biopsy results, and the doctor sitting across from her spoke a number. 8 months. She said she had sat in her car in the hospital parking lot for 2 hours, thinking about a 12-year-old child who had survived 6 homes and had never been forced to watch anyone die. She said she had called social services the next morning. She said she had told them to write in the file that the family had moved out of state, because she didn't want the word hospital appearing anywhere on the child's paper. Then Rowan Kessler stopped. She set down her teacup and spoke the next sentence in the voice of someone who had rehearsed it for 15 years and had never had anyone to say it to. She said she had been wrong. She said she had believed that sending the child away would spare her from having to watch Rowan die. Then she said she hadn't thought about the fact that the child would spend 15 years believing she hadn't been worth keeping. Lainey said nothing. Rowan stood, walked to the chest of drawers beside the window, and pulled open the top drawer. She returned carrying a stack of letters. 7 envelopes, 7 different addresses, written in blue ink in a graceful, slanting hand. Across the front of every envelope was a stamped mark, and beneath it was a printed postal notice stating that the recipient no longer lived at that address. 7 envelopes. Not one of them had ever been opened. Rowan said she had written 1 letter every year. She said she hadn't been permitted to know where the child was because she had surrendered that right with her own hand, and whenever she called social services, someone read a regulation aloud to her, so she mailed the letters to the old addresses. She knew they would be returned. She sent them anyway. And Delaney Whitaker, 27 years old, sitting in a living room in Michigan with a stack of unopened letters resting in her lap, asked one question. She asked it in the voice she had possessed at 12, the voice she thought she had left behind on those steps along with the cloth bag. She asked whether Rowan remembered her. Rowan Kessler stood for the second time. She went into the next room. Callahan Reeves remained perfectly still in his chair, looking down at the floor, and he didn't raise his eyes. She returned carrying a cardboard box. She placed it on the table and lifted the lid. Inside were drawings, a child's drawings, made with wax crayons on squared notebook paper. There was a cat. There was a tree with apples as large as heads. There was a house. There were many houses. And in the lower right corner of every drawing, there was a number written in blue ink in a graceful, slanting hand, and beside the number was a date, 1, 2, 3, 4, numbered, dated, from the first drawing to the last 48 drawings, 11 months. Lainey turned through them one by one. She didn't remember making them. She remembered that she had drawn, but she didn't remember these pictures, and that made her tremble, because it turned out the woman sitting before her had preserved a part of her that she herself had lost. At the bottom of the box, beneath the final drawing, there was another sheet of paper. It wasn't a picture. It was a pre-printed form, with boxes to check, ruled lines to complete, and spaces for signatures and official stamps. Lainey had carried 7 pages like this for 15 years, and her fingertips recognized it before her eyes had even read the words. But this page wasn't like the other 7. At the top, instead of the word transfer, were the words permanent adoption. Every box had been completed. The child's name, date of birth, the adoptive parent's name, the address, and at the bottom of the page, in the space reserved for a signature, were 2 words written in blue ink in a graceful, slanting hand, Rowan Kessler. Beside the signature was the date it had been signed. Lainey looked at that date. Then she looked up at the woman. Then she looked back down. The form had been signed on a Tuesday in April. 1 week before, Rowan walked into the examination room and heard the doctor speak the number 8 months. Sloane Merrick arrived late one afternoon, 2 weeks after the trip to Michigan. She came through the back door. That was the first thing that made Benny look up and say nothing. This woman had entered the building hundreds of times through the private elevator, and now she stood on the snow-covered steps, behind the kitchen, holding an expensive leather bag, asking whether Delaney Whitaker was there. Lainey was wiping down the chopping table. She set the cloth aside. Benny looked at her, and she gave him a single nod, and he removed his apron, called 2 kitchen assistants to come outside with him, and left the kitchen to the 2 women. Sloane didn't sit down. She stood in the middle of the kitchen, 31 years old, wearing a cream-colored wool coat, and looked around as though she were seeing a room in her childhood home that she had forgotten existed. Then she turned to face Lainey. Beneath the kitchen's overhead lights, that straight, merciless light, Lainey saw it, Sloane's left cheekbone. The powder there was thicker than anywhere else, thick enough to catch the light, and beneath it was a color that didn't belong on human skin, purple mixed with yellow, spreading from beneath the hollow of her eye. Someone had tried to hide it. Someone had tried very hard, and Lainey, who had stood in the kitchens of 7 different families, knew exactly how many layers of powder it took to conceal something like that. She didn't ask. She turned, opened the freezer of the large refrigerator, and took out a handful of ice cubes. She laid a clean dish towel across the chopping table, poured the ice into the center, wrapped it into a small bundle, and tied the corners together. Then she pushed it across the wood toward Sloane Merrick. Sloane looked at the ice pack. She didn't pick it up. She stood there, and something in her face began to dissolve, slowly, from the corners of her eyes downward, and she raised her chin as though posture alone might stop it. It didn't. She began to cry. She didn't cry beautifully. She cried like someone who had never had to cry in front of another person, and didn't know what to do with her hands, and she turned away, whispered a curse into her palm, and the person she was cursing wasn't Lainey, but herself. Because in 31 years, Sloane Merrick had learned one thing with absolute certainty, that tears were what people below used when begging those above, and now she was crying in a kitchen, in front of a waitress, surrounded by the smell of onions. Lainey didn't approach her. She said nothing. She only stood on the other side of the chopping table and allowed the woman to cry until there were no tearbas left, the same way a man had once sat in a church basement and done exactly that for her. Sloane wiped her face. A patch of powder had washed away from her left cheekbone, and she knew it, and she didn't try to cover it again. Then she spoke. She asked whether Lainey knew what the most hateful part was. She didn't wait for an answer. She said that all her life, she had believed she stood above Lainey. Not slightly above her, far above her. She said she had watched women in uniforms pass through her father's drawing room since she was 7 years old, and not once had she considered that any of them might have a name. Then she stopped and looked at the ice wrapped in the dish towel on the table. She said it turned out that she and Lainey were standing in the same place. She spoke words slowly, one by one, as though she were only beginning to understand them while saying them. Then she said the rest. She said there was only one difference. Someone had taken Lainey's coat from her. The silence after that sentence lasted so long that the hum of the refrigerator sounded like the engine of a ship. Sloane picked up the ice pack. She didn't press it to her face. She merely held it in her hand, and drops of water began running down her wrist, and she let them fall. Then she walked toward the back door. At the threshold, she stopped. She didn't turn around. She said there was something Lainey needed to know, and that she wasn't saying it out of kindness, but because she had lain awake for 4 nights and couldn't bear being the only person who knew. She said people were going to tell Lainey a story. They would say her father had planted Lainey inside this house, that she was a trap laid in advance, that the night on the 40th floor had been arranged from the beginning. She said it was a lie. Her father hadn't placed her there. Then Sloane Merrick spoke the final truth, and she said it very softly, almost gently. She said he had tried to erase her. Lainey was a witness. She had heard something, somewhere at some time, and he had spent $40,000 forcing her down to the bottom of the city until she disappeared. He had believed it was over, and now he had discovered that she was sleeping beneath the roof of his enemy. Sloane opened the door. Cold wind rushed into the kitchen, and before she stepped outside, Sloane Merrick spoke 7 words without turning around, speaking them into the darkness before her. You just haven't remembered what happened yet. The telephone rang close to 1 o'clock in the morning. It was her old telephone, the prepaid one she had stopped adding money to in October, the one that could now only receive incoming calls. She was sitting alone in the Meridian kitchen, with the overhead lights turned off, the only illumination coming from the small lamp beneath the range hood. She had been sitting there since her shift ended, and she had spent many nights there since the afternoon. Sloane Merrick walked out through the back door. She looked at the screen. The number was from Indiana. She knew those first 3 digits. She had once watched them appear 40 times a week, she answered. The man's voice was loose with alcohol, the vowels drawn out, and he said her name twice before he managed to say anything else. Then he said he hadn't abandoned her. He said it as though he had rehearsed it in his car, in the bar, on the drive back to his new home. He said he had been bought. He began to explain. He said a man had come to see him in September, someone he had never met before, and that the man hadn't threatened him, that no one had been standing behind him, and no one had blocked the door. The man had simply sat down, placed an envelope on the table, and said that if he left the state of Illinois within 48 hours and never contacted Delaney Whitaker again, the envelope would be his. He said he had sat staring at that envelope for 4 hours. He said he had debts. He said she didn't understand how much he owed or whom he owed it to. Then he cried into the telephone and said he had loved her, that perhaps he still loved her, and that he thought about her every night. Lainey listened to all of it. She didn't interrupt. She sat in the dark kitchen with one hand resting on her stomach and when he paused to breathe, she asked him one question. She asked how much. There was silence on the other end of the line. Then he spoke the number, $40,000. Lainey ended the call. She didn't say goodbye. She didn't ask whether he knew the baby was a girl. She placed the telephone face down on the chopping table and sat perfectly still. She didn't cry. That surprised her more than anything else. She had cried in the church basement over a brass key worth less than $1. And now she sat here with nothing inside her at all. She thought about the envelope lying on the table for 4 hours. She thought about that man staring at it and considering it seriously, before finally reaching out and taking it. No one had forced him. That was what made her feel cold. He had been given a choice, and he had chosen. She sat in the dark kitchen for a very long time, and then she whispered aloud to herself that it turned out she did have a price. Then she said the rest, that the only problem was that the person who paid it wasn't the person who wanted to keep her. And in the silence after those words, something shifted inside her mind. It didn't come like a flash of lightning. It came the way shapes slowly separate themselves from darkness when someone stands in an unlit room long enough for the eyes to adjust. September. He had said September. She had worked at the old restaurant until the middle of September, a place in the Loop where she served dinner to men in gray suits, and she remembered one evening. She had been pouring water at table number 7. A man sat there alone, his silver hair combed straight back, his hands trembling as he held his glass. He had been speaking on the telephone, and he hadn't lowered his voice, because in 30 years no one standing within 5 feet of him had ever been important enough to make him lower it. Lainey closed her eyes in the dark kitchen and tried to summon that evening, and she was horrified to realize it had almost disappeared. Over the past 3 months, she had slept in 4 different boarding houses. Over the past 3 months, she had worked night shifts and stood for 14 hours a day, and she had taught herself not to think, because thinking was a luxury reserved for people who had beds of their own. She had tried to forget that evening. She had tried to forget every evening, and she had succeeded. Now she sat there clawing through her memory, and she could recover only 3 fragments. The first was a name, a proper name, the name of a place, 2 syllables, resting on the tip of her tongue like a grain of grit. She knew it was the name of a warehouse. She knew it was at South Dock. The second fragment was a number, a very large number, 7 digits. He had spoken it casually, the way someone might read out the number on a player's jersey. And the third fragment was a sentence, and that sentence she remembered perfectly, every word, because he had laughed when he said it. He had said that the insurance would pay double. Lainey sat up straight, her heartbeat pounded in her ears. She tried to find a 4th fragment. She searched for a date, a month, a particular morning, anything that might tell her when. There was nothing, no date, only a name, a number, and a sentence spoken by the man whose daughter had needed 3 layers of powder to hide what he had done to her cheek. She remained in the kitchen until daylight, and she told no one. The Port Council met on a Monday morning in March and voted for 40 minutes. By noon, the docking rights at South Dock no longer belonged to Callahan Reeves. He learned the news through a telephone call that lasted 11 seconds. The caller didn't give a name. Callahan lowered the receiver, sat motionless in his study, and in all 34 years of his life, he had never known a building could be so quiet. Then he opened a drawer and took out the brown leather ledger. He began with the first page. He called each person in the exact order in which the names had been written, and he didn't prepare what he would say, because with these people, all he needed to do was speak his own name. The first person didn't answer. The second telephone rang 6 times before going to voicemail. Someone answered for the 4th, a woman's voice saying that he was in a meeting, and that voice trembled. The 11th was a county sheriff, and he picked up the telephone, then immediately hung up after hearing the first 2 words. Callahan Reeves continued calling for 4 hours. He didn't raise his voice to anyone. He left no messages. After every call, he drew a straight pencil line through the name, and those lines piled over one another from page to page, until the ledger looked like a wall slashed to pieces. By the time he reached the 214th name, night had fallen. It belonged to a retired federal judge, 79 years old, a man Callahan had pulled from a flooded car beneath Wells Bridge on a spring night 10 years earlier, and had never mentioned the incident to anyone. The judge answered on the first ring. He called Callahan by the shortened form of his name, and his voice broke. He said he owed Callahan his life. Then he said he had a granddaughter. He said someone had called his house the day before and spoken the name of the school the child attended, only the name of the school. Nothing more. Before hanging up, he said he was sorry. He said it 3 times, each time more quietly, and then he stopped speaking, and all that remained was the breathing of a man nearly 80 years old, crying in the darkness of his own living room. Callahan Reeves said he understood. He told the man not to call again. Then he lowered the receiver. He sat without moving for a very long time. Then he pulled the ledger toward himself, opened it to the first page, and tore. He tore out each page one at a time. He didn't yank them free. He pressed his thumb close to the spine and pulled, and the paper separated with a very small sound, and he placed it on the desk, turned to the next page, and did it again. It took nearly an hour. Benny Fairlamb stood in the doorway throughout that hour. He didn't enter. When Callahan reached the final page, he stopped. He looked at the stack of paper on the desk. Then, without turning around, he said that if he kept it, he would use it. He said he knew exactly when he would use it, and he knew exactly what he would say during that call. Then he said the rest. He said that if he did, he would become that man again. 3 days later, the Meridian room closed. 40 employees formed a line along the kitchen hallway. No one spoke. Callahan Reeves stood at the front with a wooden box filled with cash, and he handed each person an envelope, and he called every one of them by name. Not by surname, by name. He spoke the name of the kitchen assistant who had worked there for 7 months. He spoke the name of the man behind the bar and the name of that man's wife, and asked how her leg was healing. He called the 2 women who worked the morning shift by name, and he remembered that one of them was about to take an examination for her certification. 40 names. He held no paper. The last person in line was the woman who worked at the sink beside Lainey, Noah's mother. She accepted the envelope with both hands. She didn't leave immediately. She stood there looking at him, and she asked him one question. She asked where he would eat now. Callahan Reeves opened his mouth. Nothing came out. He stood there. The man all of Chicago had once leaned closer to hear, and he couldn't find a single word. The woman waited. Then she nodded, as though silence were an answer too, and she walked out through the back door and closed it very gently behind her. That night, Benny Fairlamb shut down the kitchen for the final time. He did it in the same order he had followed for 8 years, closing the gas valve, wiping the stovetop, hanging the 2 large pans on the rack, placing the knives in the drawer, and locking it. Then he switched off the light beneath the range hood. Callahan Reeves sat on the wooden stool in the middle of the dark kitchen. He remained there for a while, and Benny didn't hurry him. Then he spoke, and his voice was very calm, the kind of calm Benny had heard only once before, at table number 3. He said he had built all of this, so no one would ever have to lie down outside in the cold. He said that was the only thing he had ever wanted. Then he stopped. He said that afterward, he had allowed a man to kneel in his own kitchen, and that man had lost his son. He said nothing more about Wendell Pike. He didn't need to. Benny Fairlamb stood beside the cold stove and said nothing, because he knew the next sentence was coming, and he knew no one had the right to stop it. Callahan Reeves looked down at his hands in the darkness. Then he said that Maeve wouldn't recognize him anymore. At 9 o'clock on the evening of March 11th, the radio in the Meridian kitchen reported a fire in the Southern Harbor District. The announcer read quickly, the way someone reads a traffic report, and he spoke the name of the warehouse. 2 syllables. That name had rested on the tip of Delaney Whitaker's tongue for 3 months like a grain of grit, and now it dropped onto the tiled floor in the middle of the kitchen. She stood motionless for 3 seconds. Then she ran. She made it exactly 10 steps along the 9th floor hallway before her body said no. Pain pulled across her lower back, and she had to brace one hand against the wall, and she stood there breathing. 7 months. She couldn't run. She wouldn't be able to run again until all of this was over. So she walked. She walked as fast as a woman 7 months pregnant could walk, and when she reached the study door, she didn't knock. She stood in the doorway with one hand gripping the frame, and she called his name. Not Reeves. She called him Callahan. He was standing by the window. He turned, and she spoke the name of the warehouse, and she spoke the 7-digit number that a silver-haired man had once recited as casually as a player's jersey number, and she spoke the sentence, that the insurance would pay double. Callahan Reeves stood frozen. Lainey continued, and she spoke very quickly, because she knew that if she stopped, she wouldn't be able to go on. She said she had known for 3 months. She said she had remained silent because she believed silence was safe, that for 27 years she had survived by staying quiet and leaving before anyone told her to go, and that she had thought this time would be the same. Then she said that there were 2 people inside right now. The night shift. She had heard it on the radio. And she spoke the final sentence, and her voice didn't tremble. She said she wasn't going to remain silent anymore. Callahan Reeves didn't ask her a single question. He didn't ask why she hadn't told him sooner. He didn't ask what else she knew. He walked past her, touched her shoulder once as he passed, and went down the stairs. The drive took him 19 minutes. By the time he arrived, the eastern side of the warehouse had been burning for nearly an hour, and the sky above it was orange. The fire engines hadn't arrived. That was the reality of the Southern Harbor District in March. The road had been closed because of ice, and the trucks had to make a 4-mile detour. People stood in groups on the other side of the fence, and no one went inside. Callahan Reeves didn't stop at the fence. He entered through the side opening, the one used by forklifts, where the smoke was still thin. He found 2 workers in the loading area, one unconscious, the other still awake and trying to drag him out. Callahan brought them both outside. It took him 7 minutes. Both men survived. They sat on the concrete outside, breathing, and the conscious worker grabbed Callahan's sleeve and thanked him, and Callahan pulled his arm away. Because he had just asked them a question, and they had given him the wrong answer. He had asked how many people were on the night shift. The worker said he didn't know, that the list of names was in the foreman's office, that sometimes there were 2 workers and sometimes 4 depending on the week. Callahan Reeves stood. He didn't go back inside for the records. He didn't think about the records. He went back because inside that burning building there was a sheet of paper bearing the names of people he didn't know were there or not, and his entire life had been built upon one thing, that no one was ever left behind. He entered a second time. The foreman's office stood on a wooden mezzanine on the western side. He made it up there. He found the clipboard hanging from a nail. There were 2 names, only 2. Both men were sitting outside on the concrete. He turned to leave. He had made it down 3 steps when the beam supporting the mezzanine shifted. It didn't collapse at once. It tilted very slowly, and Callahan Reeves managed to step aside. But the other end came down in time to block the way, and when he regained his balance, his left leg was trapped between the beam and the steel staircase. He tried 3 times. After the 3rd attempt, he stopped. He sat down on the step, still holding the clipboard with the 2 names written on it, and he thought, very clearly and without panic, that perhaps this was a fitting end for a man like him. Sloane Merrick had entered the warehouse 10 minutes before he did. She had gone in through the northern office entrance, where the smoke hadn't yet reached, and she knew the way because she had come here 3 times over the previous 2 years to sign documents she hadn't read. That was what she had discovered on the night she cried in the kitchen, and during the 4 sleepless nights before it. Her signature appeared on the storage permit. Her signature appeared on the insurance contract. Her father had needed a name that wasn't his own, and he already had one available, a name that had sat across from him at Sunday dinner for 31 years. She found the file in the 2nd drawer. She tucked it inside her coat and retraced her steps, and as she passed the bottom of the western staircase, she looked up. He was sitting there about 7 steps above her, beneath the orange glow of whatever was burning overhead. He saw her. He didn't call out. He didn't say a single word. He only looked at her and waited, and there was nothing in his face, no pleading, no surprise, as though he had already known she would be the one to come, and had already known what she would do. Sloane Merrick remained still for 2 seconds. During those 2 seconds, she thought about the file inside her coat. She thought that if she walked through that door right now, no one in the world would ever know she had stood there. She thought about the man who had broken off their engagement in front of 200 people. She thought about her left cheekbone and the 3 layers of powder. And she thought about a kitchen that smelled of onions, where a waitress hadn't asked her a single question and had simply wrapped ice in a dish towel. 2 seconds passed. Sloane Merrick stepped toward the foot of the staircase, and she said, not to him but to herself, that if she left him there, she would remain her father's daughter forever. The hospital kept him for 3 hours. His left leg was injured but not badly, and they bandaged it and told him he needed 2 weeks of rest, and he thanked them and signed the form refusing admission. Sloane Merrick had already left. She hadn't given her name. She hadn't told anyone she had been there. People had only seen a woman in a cream-colored wool coat covered in soot, standing beside the fence until the ambulance doors closed, and then she turned away and walked toward the streetlights. Callahan Reeves left the hospital close to 1 o'clock in the morning. He didn't go home. He got into his car and sat motionless in the parking lot for 5 minutes, and then he opened the glove compartment. Inside was a piece of paper. He had folded it into quarters and left it there since the night Wendell Pike stood in the kitchen doorway and spoke the word Halstead. An address was written on that paper. Not the building at 1140. It was Otis Merrick's private residence, a 3-story house in Lake Forest, 40 minutes away by car. He placed the paper on the passenger seat. Then he reached into the pocket of his coat, took out something else, and laid it on top of the paper. It was a key. Only one, made of steel, with newly cut teeth, the kind of key made within the past 48 hours, and never inserted into a lock. Callahan Reeves had never needed a gun. That was something all of Chicago knew and no one spoke aloud. His 3 rules didn't require weapons. They required only one thing, that when he wanted to enter a house, no door could keep him out, and that the person inside would wake to find him sitting on the edge of the bed. He didn't drive to Lake Forest. He drove south, into the Halstead district, turned onto a narrow street, and parked at the curb across from an alley between 2 brick buildings. The alley was about 15 meters deep. At the far end stood 3 concrete steps leading to a side door of the building at 1140. Those steps were still there. No one had ever repaired anything. Callahan Reeves turned off the engine. Outside, the temperature was 2 degrees below zero, and snow began gathering on the windshield. He didn't turn on the wipers. He didn't drive away. He remained still, looking through the steadily thickening snow toward those 3 concrete steps, and he sat there for 2 hours. On the passenger seat, the key rested on the paper folded into quarters. He didn't touch either one. He opened his wallet. It was an old leather wallet, and in the last compartment, beneath cards he never used, there was a thin strip of printed paper about the length of his hand. It had yellowed with age. The ink had faded so badly that he had to tilt it toward the streetlight to read it. It was a bus ticket, one way, westbound, February 14th. It had been sold at 7:12 in the evening, and there was a name printed on it, and that name was Maeve Reeves. She had bought it with her own money. She had intended to go home. The bus was scheduled to leave at 5 o'clock the next morning, and she had needed somewhere to sit through the night, and she had knocked on the door of a building whose lobby lights were still on. They had found the ticket in her coat pocket. They had handed it to a 19-year-old young man at the morgue, along with a bracelet and $12, and he had signed a receipt, and he had carried that ticket in his wallet for 15 years without ever showing it to anyone. Callahan Reeves sat in the car with the ticket in his hand. He didn't cry. He only looked at it, and he thought about a 17-year-old girl standing at a ticket counter, counting loose change on the glass. And he thought about a 27-year-old woman standing at the Greyhound counter, counting $23, and he thought that perhaps they were the same girl, that perhaps there was only one such girl in the world, knocking again and again on different doors across generations, and each time there was a man sitting in a car across the street deciding whether or not to open the door. Wendell Pike hadn't opened it. Callahan Reeves looked down at the key on the passenger seat. He understood, clearly and without illusion, that if he picked it up now, he would reach Lake Forest before 5 o'clock in the morning, and that no one in the world could stop him, and that the entire city would understand, and half the city would say he was right. He also understood something else. He understood that when he walked out of that house at dawn, the man who emerged would no longer be the man who had sat inside this car. He would become the man who had remained across the street for 40 minutes and hadn't opened the car door. He would become the doorman who picked up the telephone and shook his head. He would become the person who had called down from an upper floor. Every one of them had believed they had a reason. That was what 15 years had taught him, and he had only understood it tonight, sitting in a car growing colder before an alley on Halstead Street. Not one of them had ever believed he was the villain. Snow covered the windshield completely. At 4 o'clock in the morning, Callahan Reeves folded the ticket and returned it to the final compartment of his wallet. He started the engine. He didn't pick up the key. He didn't pick up the piece of paper. He left them both on the passenger seat and drove away from Halsted Street, heading north into downtown, and he parked in front of a gray stone federal building on Dearborn Street. It was still dark. The doors weren't open yet. Callahan Reeves climbed the steps, and he knocked. The man who opened the door was a night shift security guard, and he didn't recognize Callahan Reeves, and it was the first time in 12 years that had happened. Callahan sat on a plastic chair in the lobby until 7:30. The federal prosecutor responsible for organized crime cases in the Northern District of Illinois was a 44-year-old woman named Marlene Ostrowski. She arrived at work at 7:45, saw him sitting there with soot still on his trousers and his left leg bandaged, and stopped in the middle of the lobby, unable to speak for about 5 seconds. Then she told him to follow her. In her office, she asked whether he had an attorney. He said he didn't. She told him she wouldn't listen to a single word until he had one. He made one telephone call. The attorney arrived 40 minutes later, and when he heard the first 3 sentences Callahan Reeves spoke, he set down his pen and said he needed to speak privately with his client. Callahan Reeves said that wouldn't be necessary. Marlene Ostrowski asked why he had come. She sat upright with both hands resting on a blank white case file, preparing to hear what she had heard from 20 men like him during her 15-year career. She expected a name. She expected him to say he could give her Otis Merrick in exchange for immunity, an agreement, another name written where his own should have been. That was how these things always worked. Callahan Reeves didn't say Otis Merrick's name. He said the warehouse at South Dock had burned throughout the night, that every document inside it had been destroyed, and that he didn't possess a single piece of evidence against anyone. Then he placed a stack of handwritten pages on the desk, about 3 finger joints thick. He said he had written it during the 2 hours he spent sitting in his car. Marlene Ostrowski opened it. The first page began with a name, a date, and a location. It wasn't anyone else's name, it was his. She read for 40 minutes, and no one in the room spoke a word. 12 years were contained in those pages. There were ship names and container numbers. There were the names of people who had accepted his money, people who had said yes to him, and people who had remained silent because of him. There were dates, times, and account numbers. There were matters she had investigated for 6 years without solving, and there they were, written in the cramped, slanting hand of a man who wrote quickly and never rewrote a sentence. One page described a man placed on a bus bound for Tulsa. Another described a kitchen. Marlene Ostrowski closed the stack of papers. She sat in silence. Then she told him what she was required to tell him, and she said it plainly, without circling around it, because she was decent in the way a prosecutor could be decent. She said that because of what was contained in those pages, he would go to prison. She said she couldn't promise how many years. Then she told him the second part, looking directly into his eyes as she spoke. She said Otis Merrick might never go to prison. She said she had nothing she could use against him, that the warehouse had burned, that the man had 4 law firms and an entire building filled with documents bearing other people's names, and that for 20 years she had watched men like him walk out of courthouses through the front doors. Callahan Reeves said he knew. Marlene Ostrowski looked at him. His attorney looked at him. And she asked the question anyone in her position would have to ask, the question upon which her entire profession had been built, because in 20 years no one had ever sat in that chair without wanting something in return. She asked what he was getting out of it. Callahan Reeves didn't answer immediately. He remained silent for a long time. He looked down at the hands resting in his lap, the hands that had returned a wooden stool to its proper place beside the sink, the hands that had torn 214 names from a brown leather ledger, the hands that had folded a bus ticket and placed it in the final compartment of his wallet. Beyond the 9th floor window of the federal building, the March sun was rising over Lake Michigan, and the light was very white and very cold. Then he looked up and said that he was getting to stop being the keeper of the rules. Marlene Ostrowski didn't understand at first. She would understand 2 months later, when she stood in a courtroom and watched a woman 8 months pregnant step onto the witness stand. But at that moment she only sat there, placed one hand on the handwritten pages, and called her clerk into the room. The plea agreement was signed on March 26. There was no jury. There was no trial. No one stood to argue on his behalf. Callahan Reeves accepted every charge, one by one, and asked for no leniency. and his attorney requested that the record reflect that he had advised his client to do the opposite. Otis Merrick was indicted in May, not because of Callahan Reeves. On a Wednesday morning, a 31-year-old woman wearing a cream-colored wool coat entered that same office, placed a smoke-scented file on the desk, and said the signatures inside it were hers, that she had never read what she had signed, and that she was prepared to say so under oath in court. Marlene Ostrowski asked whether she understood what that meant. Sloane Merrick said she did. Then she asked for a glass of water, and her hand trembled as she held it, and she no longer tried to hide it. The sentencing took place on May 21st in courtroom 7 of the federal building on Dearborn Street. The room wasn't crowded. No reporters had known in advance, because there had been no trial to cover, and people only reported on things that could be divided into rounds. In the third row from the front, Benny Fairlamb sat with his back straight in the suit he had bought 40 years earlier for his sister's wedding. Beside him was an empty seat. The judge was 68 years old. He had read the plea agreement, read the handwritten statement, and spent 2 weeks doing so before the hearing. At the final stage of the proceeding, he asked whether any character witnesses wished to speak. It was a formal question. In cases like this, no one usually stood, because standing meant allowing one's name to be entered into the public record beside the name of a man who had just admitted to 12 years of crimes. Marlene Ostrowski had told the judge that she had no objection. She didn't believe anyone would come forward. Delaney Whitaker stood. She rose from the third row, from the empty seat beside Benny Fairlamb, and the entire courtroom turned to look at her. She was 27 years old, 9 months pregnant, wearing a dark blue sweater and the leather shoes whose heels had been repaired 3 times. She walked from the row of seats to the witness stand, a distance of about 9 steps. She moved very slowly. At the 4th step, she had to steady herself against the back of a chair, and she stopped there and breathed, and not one person in that room spoke or even cleared a throat. The court clerk rose to help her. She shook her head. She completed all 9 steps on her own, sat down, took the oath, and gave her full name, Delaney Whitaker, the name that had been written in 7 different hands across 7 different forms. At the defense table, Callahan Reeves stared down at the surface before him. He had sat that way throughout the hearing. The judge told her she could begin. Laney placed both hands on the edge of the witness stand. Then she spoke, and her voice was clear, and she didn't look toward him. She said this man had done things she couldn't forgive. She said that first, before anything else, and a small sound passed through the courtroom as 2 court reporters seated in the corner raised their heads at the same time. She said she had stood in a kitchen and watched him make a man kneel. She said that man had a child. She said she didn't know where he was now, and that she thought about it almost every night. Then she said she wouldn't lie about it, not today, not here, not to make anything easier for anyone. She stopped. The silence lasted long enough for the judge to lean forward slightly. Then Delaney Whitaker spoke the second part. She said she had witnessed something else as well. She said that on the night of March 11th, after leaving the hospital, this man had driven to an alley on Halsted Street, where 15 years earlier, his sister had knocked on the door of a building and no one had opened it, and where that girl had lain down on 3 concrete steps on the night of February 14th. She said he had remained inside that car for 2 hours. She said that on the seat beside him was a piece of paper bearing the home address of the man who had called down from an upper floor that night, and she said that resting on top of that paper was a key. She allowed those 2 words to remain in the room. A key, not a weapon, not something that could be named in an indictment. Only a newly cut key that had never been placed into a lock, and in courtroom 7 there were at least 4 people who understood exactly what that meant, and one of them was Marlene Ostrowski. And she set down her pen. Laney said he hadn't gotten out of the car. She said snow had covered the windshield completely, and he had remained there, and at 4 o'clock in the morning, he had left the key on the seat, driven to this very building, and knocked on the door. Then she turned her head, and for the first time that morning, she looked directly at the judge. She said the court had every right to punish him for the first thing. She said it should, and that she wouldn't ask for anything. Then she spoke the final sentence, and her voice lowered, and the entire room had to lean closer to hear it. She said, "But please don't pretend the second thing didn't exist." At the defense table, Callahan Reeves raised his head. He looked at her, and the man whose entrance into a room had once made all of Chicago hold its breath. The man who had remained motionless while a friend of 12 years knelt before him on a tiled floor. The man who had never allowed anyone in the world to see his face change began to cry. He made no sound. He didn't lower his face. He sat upright and looked at her, and the tears continued to fall, and he didn't lift a hand to wipe them away, perhaps because he didn't realize he was crying. Benny Fairlamb turned away and looked out the window. The judge pronounced the sentence after the lunch recess. He read a long passage about voluntary disclosure, the extent of the cooperation, and the complete absence of any attempt to bargain, and he read it in the voice of a man explaining something to himself. Then he stated the number, 4 years. The clerk entered it into the record. Callahan Reeves stood, held out both hands, and was led through the side door. At the threshold, he stopped. For only 1 second, he didn't turn around. And Delaney Whitaker, still seated on the witness stand because she hadn't yet been able to rise, saw his right hand hanging at his side, and his fingers weren't trembling. In the weeks since that Saturday morning in Michigan, Laney had gone up there 11 times. She traveled by bus, 3.5 hours each way, and she went on the days Benny didn't need her in the kitchen. And after the Meridian closed, she went whenever she wanted. Rowan Kessler taught her how to steep tea properly. Rowan Kessler told her about the husband she had lost in 2009, and why she had never owned a dog, and about a summer she had spent in Wisconsin when she was 20 years old, and had almost never come home. Some afternoons, they didn't speak at all. One afternoon, Rowan brought out the cardboard box, and together they went through every drawing again, all 48 of them, and Rowan told her that drawing number 31 had been made on a day when Laney had a fever and refused to stay in bed. Laney didn't remember that day. Rowan did. By February, Rowan could no longer make it down the stairs. Laney moved in for good. She slept in the armchair in the living room, and she got up 4 times every night, and she was 8 months pregnant, and no one told her she shouldn't be doing this. Rowan did. One morning, very softly, she told her that she should go back to Chicago. Laney replied that she had nothing in Chicago. It was a lie, and both women knew it, and Rowan Kessler closed her eyes and didn't ask anything more. The final night was March 4th. The hospice nurse arrived at 6 o'clock in the evening, examined Rowan, and told Laney that she should stay close. Laney understood what she meant. She pulled the chair beside the bed and sat down, and she took Rowan Kessler's left hand, the hand that had addressed 7 envelopes in blue ink with graceful, slanting handwriting, and she held it. Rowan woke several times during the night. Once she called her husband's name. Once she said very clearly that the window was still open, and Laney got up and closed it even though it had been shut since November. At around 3 o'clock in the morning, Rowan opened her eyes and looked at her, and she recognized her, and she spoke her full name, Delaney, exactly the way she had spoken it when she opened the door 4 months earlier. Then she said one more thing. She told her that she didn't have to sit there. Laney said she knew, and she didn't get up. Rowan Kessler tightened her hand around Laney's once, very gently, then fell asleep again. Laney sat there until morning. She sat until the fingers in her palm grew cold, and she remained there for a long time afterward, because she didn't want to let go, and because there was no one in that house to tell her that she should. The nurse arrived at 7 o'clock. She stood in the bedroom doorway for a moment before coming inside. For 27 years, Delaney Whitaker had left 7 times before anyone could tell her she had to go. She had left a home on the 9th floor at 4 o'clock in the morning twice, and the second time, she had been so afraid that she hadn't dared leave even a single written word. She had walked out of every room before the room could walk out of her. The night of March 4th was the first night of her life that she stayed until someone else was the one who left. The funeral was held at the town church. 14 people came. A woman around 50 shook Laney's hand and said she had once been Rowan's neighbor, and that Rowan often spoke about a little girl who had stayed there for a while years ago. Laney said yes. The woman asked whether she knew what had happened to that child. Laney said she didn't know. 3 weeks later, an attorney in Grand Rapids called. He read the will to her over the telephone because Laney could no longer travel far. Rowan Kessler left her the blue wooden house with the porch and the maple tree in the yard, and she left her all of her savings. The attorney spoke the amount aloud. $40,000. Laney sat in the armchair in the living room with one hand resting on her stomach, and she remained silent long enough for the attorney to ask whether she was still on the line. She said she was still there. She didn't sell the house. She locked the door, left the key beneath the flower pot the way Rowan always had, and returned to Chicago. One morning in early April, she met with a real estate agent and gave him an address. He typed it into his computer and said the ground floor of the building had been vacant for 9 years, that it was a bad neighborhood, and that she would never find a tenant. He asked what she intended to do with it. Lainey Whitaker didn't answer that question. She asked the price, he told her. She signed the papers on April 17th, and the contract listed the building number, and that number was 1140 Halsted Street. When she left, she walked around the side of the building and into the alley about 15 meters deep, and she stood before the 3 concrete steps. No one had ever repaired anything. She remained there for a long time with one hand resting on her stomach, and she didn't cry and she didn't pray, because she had never learned how to do that. She simply stood there and looked at the side door that had been boarded shut for 9 years, and she thought about an envelope lying on a table for 4 hours and about a man who had reached out and taken it. $40,000. Once, that had been her price. Now she had bought back a door. She went into labor on the night of May 23rd, 10 days earlier than expected. Benny Fairlamb drove. He was past 60 and hadn't exceeded the speed limit in 40 years, and that night he ran 2 red lights on Ashland, and no one in the car said a word about it. In the back seat, Noah's mother sat beside Lainey and held her hand. There hadn't been time to leave the boy with anyone. He sat in the front seat, 6 years old, clutching the tin crayon box with one dented corner, and he didn't understand what was happening. And the adults had told him that Miss Lainey was about to have a baby, and that was true, and it was all he needed to know. The doctor had warned her in the 5th month. Anemia, levels far below what was considered safe, and this woman had spent 3 years standing 14 hours a day and eating whatever remained after everyone else had finished. The labor lasted from 11 o'clock at night until nearly 4 in the morning. At one point, around 3:15, they wheeled Lainey through a set of double doors and told Benny Fairlamb he wasn't allowed inside. He remained on the other side. In the waiting room, beneath the fluorescent lights, he sat beside a little boy who had fallen asleep across 2 plastic chairs. Noah slept with the crayon box still in his hand. Benny removed his coat and laid it over him. Then he sat with his back straight for 40 minutes, both hands, marked by the calluses of 8 years, resting on his knees, his eyes fixed on a single point on the white wall opposite him. Inside, Lainey began to drift away. She no longer felt pain, and that was what frightened her. She could hear people speaking, but the words had separated from one another, and then she found herself standing on a doorstep. She was 12 years old. It was July in Michigan, and the maple tree in the yard was heavy with leaves. She held a cloth bag in one hand. Inside were clothes folded very neatly, one piece at a time, and a tin of warm cookies. The car was waiting by the road. She stood there and heard the engine running behind her, and she knew she had to turn around, and she always turned around. In every dream she had dreamed for 15 years, she turned around. But this time she didn't. This time she stood still and looked at the door. And the door opened. Lainey Whitaker woke at 4:25 on the morning of May 24th. The ceiling was white. A monitor was beeping. A nurse bent over her, holding a bundle of blankets, and placed it in her arms. The baby was light. That was Lainey's first thought. How could she be so light? She had dark hair and one tightly closed fist, and her eyes were shut, and she wasn't crying. She was only breathing. Lainey looked at her daughter for a long time, and for about 3 minutes she couldn't say anything. Then she lowered her face close to the baby's and spoke the first words of her life to her. She said that she would never have to read a single form. The telephone rang at 9 o'clock that morning. They told her there was a call from the federal prison in Terre Haute, and that it was permitted to last 2 minutes. Benny handed her the receiver. She heard his breathing before she heard his voice. He asked whether she was all right. She said she was. He asked about the baby. She said it was a girl, that she weighed 2.9 kilograms, and that she didn't cry. There was a silence. Then Lainey said she hadn't chosen a name. She said she wanted him to choose it. On the other end of the line, Callahan Reeves said nothing for 10 seconds. Then he spoke one word. He said Maeve. And after he said it, he remained silent for so long that she thought the line had been disconnected. Then his voice broke, and he said she didn't have to do that. He said it twice. Lainey Whitaker sat in the hospital bed with her daughter in her arms, and she said she knew. Then she said the rest very softly, that this was exactly why she was doing it. The 2 minutes ended. The line cut off in the middle of the silence, the way it always did, without any goodbye. That night, after the baby had fallen asleep, and most of the lights on the hospital floor had been dimmed, Benny brought her a paper bag containing the things he had collected from her room. Inside was the dark blue sweater, the notebook, and the tin box. The deer on the lid had been worn away until only 2 antlers and a patch of its back remained. Lainey removed the rubber band and pried open the lid with her thumb. The 7 forms lay inside, arranged in the proper order, their edges softened by too many hands touching them over too many years. And resting on top of them, neatly stacked, were 6 envelopes. They had begun arriving during the 2nd week after the sentencing. 1 each week, postmarked Terre Haute, her name written in the cramped, slanting hand of a man who wrote quickly and never rewrote anything. She hadn't opened a single one. She had placed each envelope inside the tin, wrapped the rubber band around it again, and told herself she would open them when she was strong enough, and every week she discovered that she still wasn't. 6 weeks, 6 envelopes. She opened the first. Inside was a sheet of lead paper folded in half, and on it was exactly 1 sentence, no greeting, no signature, no date. Only 4 words written in the center of the page. You get to stay. Lainey opened the second. The same lined paper, the same sentence. She opened the third, then the fourth, then the fifth, opening them faster each time, both hands trembling, and inside every envelope there was only a single sheet of paper bearing a single sentence, written again from the beginning each week in the same handwriting, as though the writer understood that some things couldn't be said once and left alone. That some people needed to hear the same sentence this week, and the next, and the week after that, until they believed it. She opened the 6th. 4 words. Delaney Whitaker sat in the middle of the hospital bed, surrounded by 7 transfer forms and 6 sheets of lined paper, and in the cradle beside her, the daughter named for a 17-year-old girl who had knocked on a door that no one opened was sleeping. The plywood was removed from the side door in September of that year. Lainey hired 2 workers, and she stood watching them, and when the door was finally revealed, it was still intact, thick wood, peeling paint, a rusted lock. She replaced the lock. She didn't replace the door. The place opened in November. There was no sign facing the street, only a line of white lettering painted across the glass of the side door, visible from inside the alley, and the 3 concrete steps leading up to it were swept twice every day. It opened from midnight until 6 o'clock in the morning. There was no menu. There were no prices. Anyone who knocked was given food, and no one was asked for a name, and no one was asked for a reason. Benny Fairlamb cooked. He was 67 by the 4th winter, and he still woke at 10 o'clock every night, and he was still irritable with everyone. 4 volunteers worked the night shift, and 3 of those 4 had once been guests. Drawings covered the walls. They were made with wax crayons on squared notebook paper, and the artist was a 10-year-old boy named Noah, and he signed his name in the lower right corner of every picture, and he numbered them in order. He had learned to do that from a cardboard box Miss Lainey kept in a cupboard. On the counter beside the coffee machine sat a tin box. The deer on the lid had been worn away until only 2 antlers and a patch of its back remained. The lid wasn't closed. It lay open, where anyone could look inside, and there was no room left for even 1 more sheet of paper. 195 envelopes. 4 years minus 3 months. Maeve was 3.5 years old. She couldn't read. But she had learned that whenever someone took a sheet of paper from that box and unfolded it, there were always 4 words inside, and the first word always had the same shape, and the last word always had the same shape. She called them the letters that were all alike. She told Benny that the uncle was a terrible writer because he only knew how to write 1 sentence. Benny said yes, the uncle was a terrible writer, and then he turned away and shut off the stove for 2 minutes, even though nothing was cooking. Callahan Reeves left the federal prison in Terre Haute on December 19th, 5 months early. They returned an old leather wallet, a watch, and the clothes he had been wearing on the day they took him away. No one was waiting for him at the gate. He had asked for that in his final letter, the 195th, and in that letter he had written only the same 4 words as all the others, while the request itself had been made during a 2-minute telephone call. He took a bus to Chicago. He arrived at the station at 9 o'clock that evening, and he walked. Snow was falling. 9 miles from the station toward the south, through streets he had once traveled in a private car, and he walked for 4 hours, and not one person along the way recognized him. Close to 1 o'clock in the morning, he turned onto Halsted Street. He could see it from the end of the block. A pool of yellow light spilled from the alley between two brick buildings, falling across the fresh snow, and within that light shadows moved back and forth. He stopped on the other side of the street. He stood there, and he didn't cross. Then a car pulled up to the curb about 10 steps away from him. It was an old car, not the kind of car the man inside it had once owned. The door opened, and a man stepped out. Otis Merrick was 70 years old. He had been released 4 months before Callahan, after serving 21 months for insurance fraud and perjury, charges his 4 law firms had reduced as far as they possibly could, charges on which a 31-year-old woman had testified under oath. He had lost a great deal of weight. His hair was no longer combed back, and his hands trembled, and this time the trembling ran all the way up his arms, and he couldn't hide it anymore. He saw Callahan Reeves standing across the street. He didn't look surprised. Perhaps he had stood on this corner many nights before. He approached slowly, his feet sinking into the snow, and stopped 3 steps from Callahan. He carried nothing except an envelope in one hand. Then Otis Merrick spoke. He said that he had heard the knocking that night. He said that first before anything else, and he said it in the voice of a man who had rehearsed it for 21 months inside a prison cell. He said he had been on the 4th floor, that it was after 1 o'clock in the morning, that he had picked up the internal telephone, called the lobby, and told the doorman not to open the door. He said he hadn't looked down. He said he had believed it was a vagrant. Then he bent over and placed the envelope on the snow at his feet, and he had to brace one hand against his knee to straighten himself again. He said everything he had left was inside. He said he wasn't asking for forgiveness, that he knew forgiveness was impossible, and that he hadn't come for that. Then he said the rest, and his voice was very small, and snow fell between the 2 men. He said he only wanted it to go through the door he had refused to open. Callahan Reeves looked at him for a long time. He looked at the envelope lying in the snow. He looked at the trembling hands of the 70-year-old man. He thought about a newly cut key left on the passenger seat of a car on the night of March 11th, and he thought about the 3 concrete steps less than 20 paces from where they stood. He didn't bend down to pick up the envelope. He spoke 4 words. "Take it inside yourself." Otis Merrick stood frozen. Then he turned his head toward the alley, toward the pool of yellow light spilling over the fresh snow, and he stared at that wooden door for a very long time. He bent down, picked up the envelope, and walked. 3 concrete steps. He had to steady himself against the wall. Then he stood before the door, the man who had once told someone else not to open it, and he raised his trembling hand, and he knocked. The door opened. Delaney Whitaker stood there, 31 years old, an apron tied across her chest, and behind her were light and warmth, and the sound of a little boy arguing with an old man about which drawing should be hung in which place. She looked at the man on the steps. She had never seen his face before. She didn't know his name. She saw only an old man standing in the snow at 1 o'clock in the morning, trembling, holding an envelope. And Laney stepped aside, opened the door wider, and told him to come inside because it was cold. The door closed behind Otis Merrick, and the alley fell silent again, with only the pool of yellow light spilling across the fresh snow, and the footprints of a 70-year-old man pressed into the 3 concrete steps. Callahan Reeves remained standing on the other side of the street. He stood there for a very long time. Snow gathered on his shoulders and in his hair, and he didn't brush it away. He had walked 9 miles over 4 hours to reach this place, and now he couldn't cross the final 20 steps, because for 4 years he had imagined this moment every night, and in all those imaginings he had never once known what he would say. He thought about an evening 4 years earlier on the 40th floor, when he had taken the black wool coat from his own shoulders and wrapped it around a woman sitting on a stone floor, then led her through 200 people and straight out into a snowstorm, and not one person had dared to stop him. That night, he had been the one who opened the door. That night, he had been the one who decided who was allowed to leave and who had to remain. Now he stood in the snow with nothing in his hands, no one beside him, and the light was across the street. He walked toward it. 3 concrete steps. He climbed them one at a time, and on the final step he stopped and looked through the glass of the wooden door. There was light inside. He saw Benny Fairlamb bending over the stove, and he saw a boy of about 10 standing on a chair with a drawing in his hands, and he saw a 70-year-old man seated at the nearest table, with a bowl of soup before him, both trembling hands wrapped around it for warmth. And he saw something else. Just inside the door, a little girl of 3.5 was climbing onto a wooden stool. She stood upright on it, both hands gripping the door frame, reaching toward the handle, and she still couldn't reach it. She had no idea anyone was outside. She was only practicing how to reach that handle, every night, the way a 3.5-year-old child would, and everyone in the room behind her had grown so accustomed to it that no one tried to stop her anymore. Across the glass, at Callahan's eye level, there was a sentence written in wax crayon. The letters slanted and trembled slightly. The final word crowded beyond the edge because there hadn't been enough room. The handwriting of a 10-year-old boy who had written it 3 times before making it fit. No one is left outside in the cold. Callahan Reeves stood before those words. He had written 3 rules in a room 15 years earlier, and he had forced an entire city to obey them. And he had remained still while a friend of 12 years knelt on a tiled floor to prove that those rules were real. For 15 years, he had believed that keeping the rules required someone to be afraid. He looked at the sentence written in crayon, and he understood that it was the same as his first rule, except now no one had to be afraid. He raised his hand, and Callahan Reeves knocked on the door. Inside, the little girl startled. She turned toward the sound, both hands still gripping the frame, then looked up at the handle again, and this time she rose onto her toes. From inside, an adult hand settled on her shoulder to keep her from falling. The door opened. There are doors people knock upon that no one opens, and an entire lifetime is written from the silence that follows. There are doors we close because we believe we have our reasons, and we carry those reasons with us all the way to the end of the road. This story doesn't say that everyone deserves forgiveness. It only says that kindness isn't something we bestow from above, but something we offer when we ourselves are standing outside in the cold. It says that human dignity isn't measured by whether someone chooses to keep us, but by whether we remain beside another person until the very end. And it says that redemption isn't about reclaiming justice for the dead, but about opening the door that someone once chose to close. If Delaney and Callahan's story touched you tonight, please subscribe to our channel, leave a like, and share it with the person you're thinking about, so that each day we can have more stories of kindness to listen to together. How did this story make you feel? Whose door would you open if they knocked at 1 o'clock in the morning? Leave a comment and tell us what lies deep inside your heart, because we truly want to listen. May you and the people you love always be blessed with abundant health, happiness, and peace each day. Goodbye, and we'll see you again in the next video.